Good morning, history learners and colleagues who are teachers. We are assisting learners for the preparations of the September examination. And today we are going to sample a few questions, starting first with the topics and covering particular content on those topics, and then maybe going through selected question papers so that we try and guide learners as to how to go about answering such questions. The first question that has been selected for today is going to be a question from paper 1, which is going to be question 1. It is based on the Cold War, which is a source-based question, the origins of the Cold War. Now we are going to look at this topic from the advent of this phenomenon, Cold War, from around 1945 until the collapse of the Cold War, which really happened at the same time with the end of the empire, the USSR. So the time frame is going to be 1945 to 1989. Maybe the first thing that we need to start with is the concept, the Cold War. Why the Cold War? We know that war is a war which is a physical confrontation between either a country and a country or a bloc against another bloc. But this one is called the Cold War because it really never got to be a hot war. If it was to be a hot war, we would have seen a confrontation either between the USSR as one of the emissaries and the USA. But throughout the entire duration, that is 1945 to 1989, it never really got to be a hot war. It stayed within a Cold War, that is a verbal war, a war of words, a competition of some sort, because if the left was doing this, the right will be doing this. So it was a period of action-reaction because there was competition between the two countries at the time, the two superpowers, the United States of America and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, when we look at this war, the Cold War, we can really start from, or we can use the Second World War as our base, as I've indicated here on the slide, that the Second World War is where we can start looking at if we want to understand the background to the Cold War. I wouldn't really take you through the details of the Second World War because I think you will have done them, those details in junior grades in history. But what I will remind you will be that during the war, the common factor there was Germany, the aggressive Germany under Hitler. And the war, when it started, really, it was between the Axis countries and then the Allied forces. The Allied forces being led by the USA, and then Germany on the other side, together with the countries that fought together with Germany, where really the world was trying to stop the German aggression. Because you remember from Hitler, when he started breaking the shackles of Versailles, one thing led to the other. He will reclaim all territories that were taken away from Germany, the land, the population, the conditions that were set upon Germany after the First World War, because he felt they were humiliating. And he was supported by the Germans because as a proud nation, they really did not like what happened to them after the First World War. So it was because of that aggression that the countries led by the USA, and in this group you had the United States of America, you had France, you had Britain, and and Germany at a later stage, together with many other countries. No, not Germany, the USSR, sorry, at a later stage after the ill-fated invasion of Germany by the ill-fated invasion of the USSR by Germany, despite the fact that there was an agreement between the two countries. So basically, like I'm saying, it is going to be the United States of America leading the group, and then Germany leading another group which we're fighting. Now, when we are coming to the Cold War, a strange thing will happen, because when you talk about the Second World War, that is the duration of the war, from the time when the USSR entered the war, the USSR fought on the side of the Allied forces. But now, when we come to the Cold War, tables will have turned, because now we are going to look at the tension between the countries that fought together during the war, which is the USSR and the Allied forces led by the USA. And this really will stem from the fact that there were disagreement about how the post-war world was shaped. The expectations that the USSR had after the war were really not met. That is why there were going to be problems. So that's why I have listed the Second World War here from 1939, and which ended roughly 1944, and then the processes started. The other thing that we can talk about will be the wartime conferences. During the war, the Second World War, obviously from 1943, when it became clear that it was just a matter of time before Germany could be defeated, several conferences were held. And the question that was answered by these conferences was, how do we shape the world after the war? How do we avoid that we don't have a war like we have had this one? How do we make sure that we don't have any conflict of the magnitude or even close to the magnitude of the war that the world has just experienced from 1939 to 1945? That's why you had those conferences. They started at Tehran, and then the other one will be at Yalta, and then there will be a Potsdam conference. All these conferences, the main agenda there will have been, what do we do with Germany after the war? How do we approach the shape of the world after the war so that we make sure that no country is as powerful as Germany was to avoid future conflicts? And then out of these conferences, several agreements will be made. And most important agreements, which really have a bearing on what we are going to be talking about, will be the agreement that Germany should be divided. And this will happen after the war. That for Germany to have been this powerful is because Germany was a very big country. And there should be a division of the country. The country should be partitioned so that it loses some of the strength that it had in terms of human resources and natural and physical resources. Together with the agreement of dividing Germany, it was also decided that the city of Germany, which is Berlin, should also be partitioned. And we are going to see how the city was partitioned along the lines that the country itself was also partitioned. And then later on, because of the frustration that the USSR had in terms of what was happening especially in Berlin. Remember, Berlin will be divided into two. Initially, Berlin will be divided into four, but as it went on, the three countries which were like-minded, that is France, Britain, and the USA, they will combine their zones such that these zones will be run and operated as though it was one zone, and then the zone of the USSR will stay as it was. That is why we'll be having, where we had 4 zones in Berlin, we will now have almost 2 zones. The 3 combined together to form one, and the one of the USSR. Now, the assistance that the West Berlin, because the Berlin under the Western powers got to be called West Berlin, the assistance that they were getting from the superpowers led by the USA, the countries led by the superpower USA, will mean that West Berlin was going to be, comparatively speaking, was going to be better off than East Berlin. So this frustrated the East Berliners, especially the government in East Berlin, because their people will be moving over now to this better life in West Berlin. And then that will lead to the Berlin blockade, where physically all entries into West Berlin will be blocked, trying to frustrate the process of allowing the support that was coming from the Marshall Plan to reach West Berlin, and that will lead to the blockade. But because it was very important to the Western powers not to leave the West Berliners on their own devices, they will easily have left them after the blockade. But the Western countries, because they felt that the West Berlin should not be left alone, because if they were to be left alone, there was this fear that they can turn to the Soviet for assistance. And turning to the Soviet would have meant that they were now going to espouse communism. So they came with an answer. When the Soviet Union came with the blockade, blocking all access through water and roads, then they said, we are going to fly over supplies. So for about 11 months, food supplies were flown into West Berlin from the Western countries, France, Britain, and the USA. And this really nullified the impact of the Berlin blockade. And then ultimately, the conflict will crystallize such that the country now will split into 2 countries. Where we used to have one Germany, we were now going to have 2 Germanys. The Germany under the Western countries, and then the Germany under the USSR. That's why we'll have East Germany under the USSR and West Germany under the Western countries, that is France, Britain, and the USA. And then now the physical manifestation of the division will happen really in earnest in 1961 when the Berlin Wall was built, which physically divided the Berlin city physically into two portions, East Berlin and West Berlin. The division has always been there in terms of ideology, but now this one was going to represent a physical division of the city, where families will now be divided because the wall just ran across the middle of the city, such that where you used to have one city, you are now going to have two cities. I spoke about some of these conferences that were held during the war, and we said the agenda in these conferences was to decide what is to happen to the country after this. And in this photo here, you can see the three. They were called the Big Three, the three countries that fought in the war. And this, from our left, this will be Winston Churchill from Britain. This will be Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the USA, and then Stalin. I'm sure even when you look at it, you remember from the visual sources, we should take visual clues. This can immediately tell you of the situation in terms of the relationship. Because if you look at Churchill and Roosevelt, they are sort of whispering to each other and looking at each other's direction. But you can sense the gap. You can immediately sense the gap here between them and the USSR as represented by Stalin. And if you like, you can say this was the start of the rift. The gap was beginning to develop because they did not have really the same views about what the world should be like after the war. Remember, these two leaders came from the two big countries representing capitalism. That is Winston Churchill from Britain and Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the USA. And then you have Stalin here from the USSR, a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which really supported communism. So all these differences were not forgotten. At no stage, even during the war, were these forgotten. But conveniently, I think they decided not to focus on their differences, but rather to focus on the common goal, which was to defeat Germany. But now that Germany was about to be defeated, or it was defeated at the time, because we are now talking about February 1945, the differences started to surface, such that even when they were answering the question of how should the world be like after the war, the answer to that was not similar. This was one of the conferences, which is the Potsdam conferences. Let's look at the Yalta conference and some of the key decisions that were taken there. You can see here on the map that there's a representation of the four countries, the four most important countries that were involved: Britain, France, the USA, and the USSR. And then the partitioning of Germany as it was to happen, which is something that came out of the Yalta conference. Because the Yalta conference decided that answering the German question, which is what to be done with Germany, it was decided that after the war, the Allies will divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. 4 zones of occupation, because France will be having its portion to occupy, the USA will be having its portion to occupy, Britain will be having its portion to occupy, and most significantly, the USSR. And the color red here is very important because we associate communism with the color red. You can see the symbol of communism here, the cycle and the hammer. So these were the 4 zones, really, that were to be created after the war, after the defeat of Germany, so that Germany will not be strong again. And maybe borrowing from our knowledge of the map, if we look at this map here, you'll remember that the 3 countries that represented capitalism, Britain, France, and the USA, they were coming from the West. Even during the time of the war, when they were facing Germany coming from the West. And then the other partner in the war, which is the USSR, which equally participated in the war, and some will say that she even suffered more than anyone else. That is why the expectations were as high as they were in terms of compensation and rebuilding of Germany. Sorry, the rebuilding of the USSR after the defeat of Germany. So the USSR will have come alone from the East. So these are the 4 zones as they were created. But the agreement do not just stop there with the division of Germany. But the agreement also say even the city itself, which is Berlin, should be divided into 4 occupational zones along the lines of the divisions of the country itself. So where was Berlin? Berlin was right in the zone that was given to the USSR. So after the first division of the country into 4, the second focus will now to go to the zone of the USSR, where the city was. And then the agreement was the city itself should also be divided into 4, sliced into 4, like a cake that will be sliced into 4 and then shared among the 4 as the country was shared. Such that now we are talking about the division of Germany as well as the division of Berlin. And then here we are talking about Stalin's view of Germany. Stalin had a different view of Germany to what the superpowers was having about Germany. And this really has to do with the geography. You remember I alluded to the fact that the 3, France, Britain, and the USA, they were coming from the West. And then this is Germany, of course. The rest is Germany here. But the USSR will have been coming from the East. And there were examples from early on that showed that a strong Germany was bad news for the USSR. There were about 2 different occasions where the USSR was attacked by Germany, including the attack of 1941, which really happened despite the fact that there was that non-aggression pact that was signed between Germany and the USSR. So what the USSR wanted was, now that the world has got an opportunity of handling and dealing with the defeated Germany, the USSR, she wanted Germany to be destroyed so that Germany never rise up to the power that she had, the power that led to the aggression during the war. So according to the USSR, what will have satisfied them will have been to see this country completely crushed, this country completely disempowered such that it can never rise again. But that view was not shared by the rest of the countries that fought together with the USSR during the war. That was not shared by Britain. It was not shared especially by France and the USA. I'll tell you why I say especially by France. In terms of proximity, in terms of the distance, the closeness, France of the 3 is the closest to Germany. And France wanted Germany to stay strong so that in terms of future aggression from the USSR, Germany should be a buffer between France and the West against Germany, whereas against the USSR. Whereas at the same time, the USSR wanted Germany to be completely flattened out. So the 3 countries, Britain, France, and the USA, much as they wanted Germany to be punished after the war, they did not want Germany to be completely destroyed. That is why, as I said, there were now divisions in terms of how are these countries who fought together during the war, how do they want to see Germany being after the war? So those divisions were started to be there. So this one is the division of Germany, where we see the division of Germany, and then we have got our key here. It shows the different zones. This zone will have been the zone that was controlled by the United States of America, and then this zone will be the one that was controlled by Britain, and then this one will have been the zone controlled by France, and then the Soviet Union will have its own zone. But I said the 3, the zone of first the zone of Britain, of the USA, and the zone of France. Remember, these countries, the 3 of them, were like-minded in terms of their preference for economic and political systems. That is why they will join their zones together. First, it will be the zone of the United States of America and Britain. That came together, and they started to administer them as one zone. And then later, France joined, such that the 3 will now be running their zones as one thing. And then this will isolate and leave Germany alone, and then Germany will run its zone alone. And the same thing that has happened to the zones in terms of the country will also happen to the city, because the city was also divided along the same lines. Having amalgamated, that is the 3 countries, France, Britain, and the USA, having amalgamated their zones, they will also amalgamate their zones in the city. It's a bit confusing. But we should remember that first the country was divided into 4, and then the city was divided into 4. Even in terms of amalgamation, the zones from the country, which were 4, they will be brought together. The 3 of them will be brought together. That is the one of France, Britain, and the USA. And then the Soviet one will stay alone. Even in terms of the city, the same will happen. The zones in the city, the same will happen. And then the USSR will also have its share. So now what will arise from Germany will be West Germany and East Germany. What will arise from the city Berlin, which used to just be Berlin, will be West Berlin and East Berlin because of the divisions. All right, here is just reference to one of the conferences that I earlier spoke about, that is the Yalta conference, to say out of this conference it was decided that part of Poland was going to be annexed, and then the western border of Poland will be shifted into what has been Germany, and then with this, about 6 million Germans were uprooted. They were affected by that. Because if you take away a territory, you take away a territory as well as the people who are residing in that territory. This is the Yalta conference, which continued, and then this will be the leaders. Still Churchill, and then now Harry Truman. Because initially when we talked about the big three, we talked about, you'll remember, we talked about Winston Churchill, who was representing Britain. But because of change of leadership in the USA, instead of number 2 here as being Franklin Delano Roosevelt earlier on in the Yalta conference, now that we are talking about the Potsdam conference, the leader here now was Harry Truman, and then Stalin stayed. And I'm sure, again, the gap that I was talking about, you can even sense it here. You can see the closeness between the two and the gap, because as historians, we need to look at clues that will assist us. And even you remember the photo that we looked at during the Yalta conference, the two, but at the time it was Churchill and Roosevelt. They were looking at each other's direction. But even here, even though you now have got different personalities, because it is now Truman and Churchill, they are still looking at each other's direction. And look at the distance also. The distance is still very narrow. The same thing that happened with the Yalta conference. And the same thing that we said of the rift beginning to happen, you can see it here. Stalin is a bit aloof from the rest, because really, you know, politicians can publicly want to disguise the real feelings and attitude towards one another, but sometimes if you are awake enough, you are able to pick up clues which will assist you to understand that things are not as rosy as they are presented to be for the cameras. And then this is the continuation of the conferences. And then in Britain also, remember all along we have been talking about Winston Churchill, but there was a change of leadership now from Britain, where you now have Clemens Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain. You still have Truman, and then you still have Stalin. And throughout the whole period, you can realize that for the two countries, for Britain and for USA, there has been a change of leadership. But the USSR, throughout the entire period, we have been talking about Stalin. When we started talking about Britain, we started first with Winston Churchill, but now we are talking about Clemens Attlee. When we talk about the USA, we started talking by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We are now talking about Harry Truman. But with the USSR, consistently, it was one person. And that has got an implication on it. Then this is the Potsdam Conference. And then beside for Germany being punished with territory being taken away from her, there was also reparation that has to be paid, where 20 billion was to be paid. And where will this 20 billion go? If a country is defeated in a war, like Germany was defeated in a war, because she was found to have been the aggressor, the money will be shared by the countries that defeated the one which was defeated, and in this case it is Germany. And the USSR expected a lot from this. The USSR expected to get a lot from this compensation, because even by the admission of Britain and Britain, France, and the USA, they knew that the USSR suffered a lot. And you will remember that one of the reasons why the USSR suffered a lot is because while the three, the USA, France, and Britain, while they were assisting each other, facing Germany from the west as a front, from the Western Front. The USSR was coming from the east alone. And this led to massive, massive losses by the USSR. Losses in terms of human life, losses in terms of resources and the investment that the USSR made in the war. That is why the USSR expected a lot or a greater slice out of this portion of reparation so that she could be able to rebuild the country after the war. And maybe this is the reason why, because when we talked about the Berlin blockade, we said Berlin was blockaded because the USSR was frustrated by the fact that her part of Berlin was not developed. And the part of Berlin under the superpowers, it was, so not under the superpowers, under the countries led by the superpower USA, that part of Berlin was flourishing and life was better there. It was mainly because those three countries, they really did not suffer during the war as the USSR had. That is why after the war, when they got their portion of compensation, instead of pocketing that compensation, they reinvested it in the development of Germany or their part of Germany. Whereas the USSR, it really was depending on the compensation that she was getting from the money paid by the Germans. That is why, obviously, there will be a gap, a glaring gap in terms of the development between West Berlin and East Berlin. Maybe that's why the USSR got frustrated and then Stalin blockaded all roads leading into West Berlin, because Stalin or the USSR could not offer their Berlin what the Western countries were offering to their part of Berlin, which is West Berlin. And then these are the reasons why the expectation of the USSR was small. They lost about 27 million productive Soviet, and then they wanted this compensation, and also remember they were punished by the Germans. They had this feeling that Germany should be made to pay because they know how dangerous Germany could be, especially a strong Germany. We are continuing with the agreements from the Potsdam conference. I really am not going to go into the details, but the main thing that we need to know from these conferences is that the Germany was to be divided, and the USSR, the superpower, the countries under the leadership of the superpower USA, they were very cautious about the strength of the USSR in terms of the eastern satellite states, which the USSR was using as a buffer. And then this photo here depicts Stalin and what he was intending to do. To say Stalin from the east, from the USSR, wanted to do all that he could to keep control over the satellite states. By satellite states, we mean those states that were under the control of the USSR. Why was he interested? You can see them, they're forming a line here. He wanted, of course, the main thing would have been to tap into the resources of these states so that the USSR, could better her economy, so that she could further influence and speed up the process of spreading communism into this. But the main thing also was to create a buffer, that these states should form a line of protection for the USSR against future aggression from France, Britain, and the USA, or even from Germany itself once it reconfigure itself and develop maybe at a later stage. So this was the expectation of the USSR. And then the continuation of the Potsdam Conference. Now, when we talk about the expectations of the two countries, the two superpowers after the war, the USA and the USSR after the war, we said they really did not have seen things the same way. And you can see it here, that after the war, much as the USSR was aware that Germany was the aggressor during the Second World War, but they wanted Germany to reunite into one country, which was not shared. This view of reuniting Germany was not shared by the USSR because of the knowledge that the USSR had of a strong Germany. So they wanted as much as they could, the Soviet Union, that Germany should be kept weak and divided. And then the USA, at the same time, they wanted to rebuild the economy of Europe, including the economy of Germany. That is why even with the Marshall Plan, And the aid that was coming from the Marshall Plan, yes, it's fine. It was meant for all countries that needed that assistance. But the main benefactor of this assistance would have been Germany, because the USA, France, and Britain, they wanted a strong Germany for the future, because for them, a strong Germany will be a helpful ally against future USSR aggression. And again, they wanted not to leave space in Germany for encroachment by the USSR. Because if Germany was to be weak, the USSR could easily offer itself an assistance to Germany. And once you offer assistance to a country, that will come with expectations. And the great expectation will have been by the Soviet Union to spread communism into Germany, something that the superpower USA as well as Britain and France would not have wanted to see happening. They wanted to promote free trade and freedom, democracy and self-determination. And the end goal was this one of capitalism. And remember, the Marshall Plan was really aimed at that. Develop an economic recovery package which we are going to assist European governments as well as Germany, so that even if it was not explicitly said, but we will know that the end goal will have been to win these countries over to support capitalism. And then at the same time, like I said, the USSR expected Germany to remain weak and divided, and they wanted to create a buffer zone between the USSR and Germany. The USSR wanted to have a buffer zone. That is why the USSR wanted to keep the Eastern Europe satellite states, which were between herself and Germany, as a buffer, because she knew that in the past she was attacked by Germany on more than one occasions. That is why she wouldn't really rest until she's sure that she's safeguarded against future aggression of the Germans, as we have seen under Hitler, when Germany became aggressive, leading to the outbreak of the Second World War. And then, of course, the main aim will be to spread communism. The main aim of the Soviet will have been to spread communism. That is why in their portion of Germany, that is East German, in their portion of Berlin, which is East Berlin, they will have made sure that communism sees the light of day there. And then communism was the practice. And then here we are talking about a leader who took over after Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he was not as accommodating of the USSR as Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been. That's why we say his view of the Soviet Union had negative effect, because he really didn't want to allow the USSR to bully Europe, because he felt that the USSR was proving to be a bully and she wanted to bully the rest of Europe. And then this is Stalin at the same time. When these were the views of Harry Truman, these were the views of Stalin, who wanted Soviet expansionism and consolidate the existing control in terms of the satellite state that she was already owning. And then the warning signs started to be there as early as 1946, where Senator Arthur Vandenberg said that, "I'm more than ever convinced that communism is on the march on a worldwide scale, which only America can stop." This is from the senator in the American government, who was saying the differences between capitalism and communism are irreconcilable, and very soon we are going to have a war. And this war, the Americans, the USA, is the only country that can be strong enough to can stop that. That is why maybe at the later stage we are going to have the Marshall Plan, we are going to have NATO. Marshall Plan being an economic recovery plan, and then NATO being a structure which was to provide military support to one another. And then this is the speech that really can be seen as Stalin's response, to say the development of world capitalism proceeds not in the path of smooth and even progress, but through crisis and catastrophes of war. This was a take on capitalism, to say capitalism flourishes where there has been problems, there has been crisis, because this exactly happened after the Second World War. Those countries that were attracted to capitalism, it was because of the assistance that they were given. And Stalin is saying this is exactly what capitalism is. It takes advantage of weaknesses of people, provide them with assistance, and win them over. And then, so capitalism made war inevitable. So the Cold War, you can see it now starts, because he's saying as long as there is capitalism, war is unavoidable. War between the USA and the USSR is unavoidable, because these are the two countries representing two different ideologies. And then this is the speech by Stalin. It continues, and then the reaction of the USA. Immediately the USA said this speech that was made by Stalin is like a declaration of war, and obviously the USA was going to respond. The first response came from George Kennan, one of the first officials sent to the new US embassy in Moscow. He said that there can be no possible middle ground or compromise between the two. The two are irreconcilable, capitalism and communism, USSR and USA. The two systems cannot exist in the same world unless an economic cordon is put around one or the other of them. Unless one of them respond and protect those who agree with him or her, this cannot be put to rest. That is why, obviously, at a later stage, there's going to be response in terms of economic assistance and military assistance. And then this is George Kennan. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I wanted us to come to this one, the Iron Curtain, which was really coined by Winston Churchill in March 1946, where he said, the world is literally, not literally really, but the world is figuratively dividing into two. And between these two worlds, there is an Iron Curtain which is dividing them. Not a literal Iron Curtain, but a figurative Iron Curtain. That there is this division, there's this solid division between the West and the East. There is this solid division between the countries led by the USA and the USSR on the other side. There is this solid division between capitalism and communism, and something has to be done about this so that one emerges victorious out of the two systems, either capitalism and communism. And this being Winston Churchill from Britain, obviously we will know that the system that he favored would have been capitalism. And then this is the speech, and then the division of Germany. This is the curtain that the curtain that Winston Churchill was talking about when he said the world was being divided into two. I will fast forward to the Marshall Plan. There's Harry Truman, and this is in response to what was said by the officials before, that the seeds of totalitarian regime are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. So this really was calling America into action. That is why after that, Marshall will come with his plan, the Marshall Plan, which was an European recovery plan. This is the plan that we are talking about, that America had to respond. And in 1948, America did respond by developing an economic recovery package led by George Marshall, the Secretary of State, the Minister of they call their ministers secretaries. So he was a Secretary of State in the USA. And then these are the scenes really that called America into action to say, for as long as countries in Europe are as poor as this, they will accept anything. So we should pull the red carpet from underneath the feet of the USSR by coming up with something, because if we don't, then these people are likely to accept anything, because for them, anything will go. And then this will be the Marshall Plan, the continuation of the Marshall Plan and what the plan entailed. And this is just a good example that will show you the effect of the Marshall Plan. To say one city is taken as an example here, Hamburg. In 1947, this is how Hamburg was. War ravaged, destroyed, and remember, the USA wanted to avoid destruction, because people who are survivors of destruction will accept anything that will come from them, and the USSR could use this opportunity. That is why with the Marshall Plan, just a few years thereafter, this is how Hamburg will look. So this shows you development. This shows you the fruits of investment which were done through the Marshall Plan to Hamburg. And then the Marshall Plan continues. And then, of course, the USSR will also respond with its own plan, which is the Cominform. I'm not going to go into the details of the Cominform, but the USSR did respond also, because they really did not want to allow the USA to take charge and allow capitalism to be rife. And then, as I've said, this will be really the gist of what this topic is about, taking it from 1945 with the division of Germany until 1961 when the wall was literally built. I hope this summary is going to assist you to really deal. Of course, there are a lot of things that are still left out of the summary, but the summary should give you a structure that learners can use as they are preparing for exams, and teachers can use to feed into other details so that learners are really rounded in terms of their knowledge of this period. Thank you very much.